Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to be talking about two projects that I did, one in the Muslim world and another in the United States. And I'm going to be relating the findings because what we did was we asked similar questions in both places. So we have essentially mirrored opinions from the Muslim world and then from Muslims in the United States and also Americans in the United States about Muslims. So I'm going to be comparing those two, but I wanted to give you essentially the conclusion from what we came up with, which is the most important thing to improving relations between Muslims and the United States is actually the perceived negative image of the American public of Islam and of Muslims. And one thinks that it wouldn't be a big issue, but it actually was the biggest issue from 8 Muslim countries that we went to in 2006 all the way back to the United States. And so I'll be looking at that more in depth throughout the talk. So the first project that I did was Journey into Islam with Akbar Ahmed. He is a Pakistani professor at American University, and I was a research assistant, and we went to 8 Muslim countries. We went to Qatar, Turkey, Jordan, Syria, Pakistan, India, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And we interviewed over 2,000 people throughout that journey, from heads of state, including President Musharraf, Benazir Bhutto, members of foreign ministries, all the way down to average people on the street, taxi drivers, university students, etc., even going to madrasas. And we really tried to get an overview of the Muslim world as far as conservative, quote-unquote moderate, Sufi, all these different things, which I'll talk about as well. And we took an anthropological approach, which means that it wasn't just, do you like the United States, yes or no? It was much more in-depth and involved. And I'll get into the context and what we gained as far as that methodology went as well. But we did have questionnaires. So they were open-ended questionnaires, so we would just say, who are your role models, past and present? And this gives us a window into what Muslims were thinking, because in many of these countries there weren't possibilities of speaking totally freely. For instance, we were in Syria, and they couldn't necessarily voice their real political opinions. So instead, we found a way to have them voice their political opinions symbolically and give us their role models. We also did that in the United States, and I'll compare those as well. We also asked, where do you get your news? What is terrorism? Is it ever justified? And what do you think of America and Americans? So then, when we came to the United States, for Journey into America, which was published by Brookings Press in 2010, we went to 27 states. We interviewed over 3,000 Muslims and non-Muslims. And we asked them the exact same questions, but mirror imaged if we needed to. So instead of saying, what do you think of America and Americans, we said, what do you think of Muslims? Or what do you think of Americans for the Muslims in the United States? And these Muslims were from all over the globe. So whereas in the Muslim world, we went to the Arab world, South Asia, and Far East Asia, or Southeast Asia, excuse me, we actually interviewed Muslims all the way from Central Asia and China to South America to Africa, all over, converts as well. And the breakdown of that is actually roughly a third of American Muslims are Arab, roughly a third are South Asian or Indo-Pakistani, and a third is pretty much everyone else from Asia, etc., or the African American or white converts. So that was over 10 months, going to 27 states. And another question that we asked was, can a Muslim be an American? Which was a very hot button question, but one that we thought was very important to ask. The similarities we found between the two are quite interesting. Across the board, it didn't matter who the Muslim was, young, old, secular, moderate, etc. The number one role model from the past was the Prophet Muhammad. And through interviewing thousands of Muslims, I only had a couple of examples where someone did not say the Prophet Muhammad. So it's very important for us to understand how important he is symbolically and emotionally for Muslims when we deal with Muslims on a personal level and at an international level. This is a really important point for us to keep in mind. Secondly, we found that the Orthodox model is strong. When I talk about the Orthodox model, we actually came up with 3 different types of Islam or approaches and interpretations to Islam that are present throughout history and that are still present today and constantly influencing each other, battling for what Islam means and how it should be interpreted. So one of the models is the mystic or Sufi model, which is very humanist and open. The second is the modernist form of Islam, and that's very legally minded, but it's also the democratic strain, it's also the secular strain, but these are ideal types as well. So you can have elements of all 3 even in a single person or in a single movement, such as the Arab Spring. Because finally, the third model is the Orthodox or literalist. And that, we believe, is the strongest model right now in the in the Muslim world, excuse me. And it's mainly the most important because of the perception that Islam is under attack. So if Islam is under attack, and we have seen that the number one role model for all Muslims, period, is the Prophet Muhammad, so obviously there is some importance attached to Islam no matter who you are. If you feel that it's under attack, then naturally one would support the model that is the most strong in defending that identity and that idea of Islam. And what's important is that the Orthodox literalist does contain the extremists and the terrorists, but absolutely by no means are all Orthodox terrorists or believe in using violence at all. Having said that, where we have possibly gone wrong in the past is assuming that strong Muslims are usually extremist in some way. So what we need to do, what I will argue, is that we really need to engage with this model. We don't need to say that, okay, this is not what these are not the people that we should rely on, these are not the people we should talk to, we should ignore them. They cannot be ignored at this point. And as we have seen also with the Muslim Brotherhood coming in, it's very important that we understand who the Orthodox model is, what they represent, and how popular they are right now and why. Finally, can terrorism ever be justified? Well, there was obviously wide condemnation of terrorism and killing of innocent people, whoever they were, whatever religion. But in both America and the Muslim world, some people did say that terrorism could be justified under certain circumstances, such as self-defense. So obviously how one frames self-defense and aggression is very subjective. So that usually, and what terrorism is, what aggression is, etc. And we also asked, in conjunction with the role models question, who should represent Islam? So that was our main question going into the initial project, was who should represent Islam? And one thing that I found is that no one should represent Islam was the #1 response across the board, which shows that Islam is a very egalitarian religion. It's not like the Catholic Church where there's a pope or something. But at the same time, it also represents a bit of uncertainty about what Islam is right now, who should represent it. There is a lot of confusion and not knowing who they are right now. And that's also represented by the role model question, which I'll look at next. But on the positive side, the second most important, or the second most cited who should represent Islam answer was practicing knowledgeable Muslims and scholars. So it wasn't just terrorists should represent Islam, or a single political person. So it was, they do have a lot of respect for scholars and knowledge, and actually ilm, which is knowledge in Arabic, is the most used word in the Quran. So that is a very important point. So for the differences, about 10% of our respondents abroad at the time in 2006 cited Osama bin Laden as a role model, but almost none in America, which is very interesting. That could also be because when we were traveling around the United States, a lot of people thought that we were working for the government, which we were not. But a lot of them were a bit timid about speaking their minds with us as well, which was what we expected abroad, not necessarily in the United States. But for American Muslims, there were a wide variety of contemporary role models as well. There was Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Muslim American leaders, and in the Arab world, there was no clear unity. Osama bin Laden was not by any means a clear winner in the role model. About 10% of our respondents abroad said Osama bin Laden, but it was definitely at certain institutions that they said that, and it was not by any means representative, and there were no clear Arab or otherwise role models around the world that came out as #1. So that definitely shows a bit of disunity, a bit of confusion, and at the time, a certain malaise about what was going on in the Muslim world. And I think that's definitely changed since the Arab Spring. But I think that's an opportunity that really needs to be capitalized on, because if there are no emergent leaders that stand for justice and democracy and things like that, this could be a huge need that will not be filled. Let's see. Also, for women, women have a greater role in the Muslim world than is generally thought in America. When I came to the United States, when I returned back from my trip, many Americans asked me, "Oh, I'm sure the Muslim women are so oppressed, and I'm sure they have no access to education," things like that. Actually, in Qatar, for example, more women are enrolled in universities than men. And women do have a lot more rights than is the general stereotype. I'm sure I'm talking to a much more educated audience, but it is important what the American public think. And Muslim women do really have more than is stereotypically thought, more access to politics and resources and education. But the real bright side is the Muslim women in the American community, the American Muslim community. There was an article about Muslim women, which I can actually put up for you all, in the New York Times, about how Muslim women are leaders in the American Muslim community. And I actually gave the names of those women for that article because they're really incredible. The head of the Islamic Society of North America is Ingrid Mattson. She's very impressive and head of the largest Muslim organization in the United States and North America. There's women who are entrepreneurs and leaders in their community, and it's very important that we recognize this trend and use it effectively to start building on this trend that is happening also in the Muslim world. But at the same time, American Muslims in the rest of the Arab world, in the rest of the Muslim world, are not seen as quote unquote real. They're not taken as seriously as real Muslims, quote unquote. It's definitely, they're seen as disconnected and slightly different, and the scholarship, which is really excellent, that's coming out of the United States among Muslim Americans, is not taken as authentically and authoritatively as something coming out of, say, Al-Azhar in Egypt would be. And this will take time, but I see a huge potential for Muslims in the United States. And I think simply time will change that. And also promoting Muslim American scholars and things like that around the world and their writings and their scholarship, and having a real academic dialogue as well will be very important for changing this dynamic as well. So the main problem, though, across the board, between when we ask people what is the main threat or the main problem with the United States, both to Muslims in the Muslim world and Muslims in America, the absolute number one threat to Islam was American perceptions of Islam, which they thought were very negative. And often Muslims would ask me if Muslims are treated badly in the United States. And when I would tell them that there's freedom of religion and that there are actually over 2,000 mosques in America and that Muslims can practice freely, they wouldn't necessarily believe me. And this is something that's really important because when we actually asked Muslims in America how it was to be a Muslim in the United States, across the board, only I would say less than 5%, not even, said that it is absolutely the best place on earth to be a Muslim. That was something we did not expect at all. And I think that's something that Muslims around the world would be very interested to know. Muslims in the United States cited the freedom of religion, economic opportunities, freedom of thought, things like that as really big advantages to being a Muslim. And also they found that there was a lot of religious respect as well. But along with that also is relations between Muslims and non-Muslims are getting worse, not better, even 10 years after 9/11. And unfortunately, in 2008, we saw this trend, and there was this simmering anger towards Muslims that had not been resolved since 9/11. And things like last month, when there were 8 attacks in 11 days on mosques in some way, either shooting rifles at the walls or trying to throw bottles of acid. And we decided to ask Americans as well what they thought of Islam. So I had the rough estimate just from talking with thousands of Americans over this trip, from the Northeast to the South to Hawaii to the West Coast. About 50% of Americans had actually negative views of Islam. That does not mean that they would act on them at all. But the other 50% were not positive. They were simply, I don't know enough about Islam to say that I do or don't have a negative opinion on it. They simply said, I know not all Muslims are terrorists, but I don't know what else they are. The biggest threat, perceived threat in the Muslim world is American public views of Islam. But when we asked Americans what is the biggest threat to America, the number one response was intolerance and ignorance. And this ignorance could also be um, failing education standards, ignorance in our governing structure, and inability to continue to govern ourselves. So it wasn't just ignorance of other cultures, which we also see ourselves as not being able to compete in the global market because we don't know about other cultures as well. Um, but on the bright side, when we asked Americans whether they would vote for a Muslim for president, 90% said they would, and almost all said a Muslim can be an American. So that's very positive. At the same time, I found also that Americans have a tendency to generalize. They say, well, Muslims don't know that we're not our government, so when we um, when we invade Iraq or Afghanistan, they blame it on all Americans, but that's not really how it is. Or the terrorists hate us because of this. And I didn't find that type of generalized thinking in the Muslim world. I found that often they could very clearly distinguish between the American people and the American government and their foreign policy. I think that comes from the fact that in America we do have a democracy and people do actually inform policies, and there's a much more fluid and close relationship between the public and the government. Whereas in the Muslim world, it's mainly dictatorships. And the people there have absolutely no say whatever in foreign policy or domestic policies even. So Muslims, I found, were very open to Americans, really liked Americans, and felt a bond, an instant bond with me. I found them very welcoming, but at the same time, there was huge anti-Americanism towards the government, and this has not gotten better either since 9/11. So, what are the recommendations? Well, the media has an absolutely huge role to play. It shapes the opinions, perceptions, and therefore actions of people. Whatever these generalized phrases that come out, the Islamofascists or the terrorists, things like that, that is repeated back because Muslims all over the world did tend to watch not just local media like Al Jazeera and things like that, they also watched American and Western media as well. They were very informed media consumers and they got a wide range of media, so they had the ability to compare. And they would say, why do you always call us terrorists? Everyone. And it really affects how they think and feel about the United States and the West in general. So it's important to keep in mind this very important role that the media can play. And also how they report things and what they report. So uh, attacks on a mosque or the shootings in Oak Creek against the Sikh temple, if those are not called terrorist acts, but something else that a Muslim does against another community is called a terrorist attack that is fairly similar, they tend to get, they do see that as double standards, and many Muslims do get angry about it. So it is important how things are reported and how they're framed in order to affect thoughts and emotions of Muslims. So, as I said, the number one perceived threat to Islam and the Muslim world was American negative perceptions. And that is used as a huge recruiting tool for extremists and terrorists. They can say, we are defending Islam. There is this huge threat. They don't like us, so therefore we need you to help us defend it. If we take that out, if we diffuse the situation and start having a more nuanced approach towards Islam, that will dry up a huge pool of resentment and a huge pool of potential supporters for their cause. It's also important that what happens in one part of the world has an effect in another. So if one bomb happens in Pakistan, then perhaps someone's relative is now in the United States. You know, our borders are not as solid as they used to be. It is a very globalized world, and even if it's not as direct as someone's relative, it is totally global. And these issues are global. So we need to always keep in mind the domestic and the international now when we're forming policies and trying to deal with them. The positive thing that I saw as well in talking with Muslims abroad and in the United States was that when we asked, well, what would you do to make this better? What can we do to bring the United States and the Muslim world together? And the answers were largely dialogue, education, and also a return to Islam, because the same values that the United States has of justice, equality, knowledge, these are also in Islam. So I think that's actually a huge positive for us as well to build on. And the Arab Spring, I think, is a fantastic opportunity to do that. People would often say we love the United States for its freedom, for its economic opportunities, for its freedom of speech. These are the things that makes America popular. It's not why we draw criticism. But as has been happening even since 2009, when President Obama gave his Cairo speech, Muslims have grown disillusioned with American ideals, such as talks of freedom and democracy and things like that. And then our actions don't match up with what we say. So I was in Egypt about 6 months before the revolution, and even then, in a very educated audience, in front of hundreds of people, many people were saying, okay, we can hear these speeches like Obama's, or there were other American officials there as well, repeating many of the same very good themes of freedom and support for democracy, things like that. But they said, where's the action? You can talk to us all you want, but you really need to back up what you say with real concrete plans, and also support for later, support for the democratic movements that were going on. So it's very important that what we say matches up with what we do. We also need to engage with the Orthodox model. We need to understand what they want, where they're coming from, and we need to understand that also their perception of us having, or Americans having, negative perceptions of Islam is a baseline for our interactions. So it's very important that we take that aspect out of the equation. It's also important in the Arab Spring that we encourage all of these new democracies to incorporate marginalized voices. And that is something that the United States is very good at, and that Muslim Americans have been dealing with, because they have very multicultural mosques and communities and deal with many different religions. So I think that's one way that we can really use our cultural resources to help bring about bonds and strengthen democracy in the Arab world. I can end with a very sad example, but actually a very hopeful example of a mosque that was attacked in Columbia, Tennessee in 2008. 3 men from the Christian identity movement painted swastikas and drew white power on the outside of a mosque in Columbia, Tennessee, a very small town, and then proceeded to throw Molotov cocktails there and burnt it down. And unfortunately, it didn't even make internet or national news, which is one example of the media having an important role. But out of this really sad and disappointing experience, a local Presbyterian church actually raised money and gave it to the mosque and the Muslim community, and then offered them use of their church for prayers. Another side note is that the president of the mosque has a young son, and he had previously been teased at school for being a terrorist, and then this very traumatic experience happened to him. So I actually wrote an article about experiences like this and how it can affect Muslim children in the future, and that's on one of the web links, so it's over here. I have the Columbia Mosque attack as well. We did a video on it for our documentary and blog, journeyintoamerica.wordpress.com. So you can watch that. It's about 8 minutes, but you can also read my article on young American Muslims and how this psychological trauma can affect them later. So it's really important for us to tackle views of Islam because it is the #1 important issue in dealing with the Muslim world, Muslims in America, and the United States in our foreign policy. It's absolutely vital that we change perceptions and really sift out the issues that are affecting us, and be able to talk to Muslims without this extra baggage. And also so that it doesn't affect later generations, as I argue in my article on young Muslims. So anyway, I can start taking questions now. This is my email, just in case anyone is interested. But okay, let's see. So Larry Wright asked, did the issue with the proposed mosque in Tennessee come up during your research? Is the lawsuit to prevent it being built? I think you're referring to the one in Murfreesboro, and we actually did the research before that, but it was, we found other similar examples. There was one in Houston, outside of Houston, in Katy, Texas, I believe, and it was an exactly similar situation to the one in Murfreesboro. There was another example of a loudspeaker not being able to be put up in a mosque in St. Louis, things like that. The New York mosque with Imam Rauf and the Cordoba Initiative, that was another big one. So that does come up a lot. Sorry, so the plaintiff challenged Islam as a religion. So I'm not actually sure. I'm not familiar with that aspect of the case. I mean, I think we can all agree that Islam is an actual religion. So yeah, I'm not familiar with that aspect, unfortunately, but I think this goes with the rest of it, that around the world, Muslims perceive Muslims in America as not being able to practice their religion freely. And by not being able to build places of worship, that just feeds into that stereotype. And unfortunately, this has been increasing since 9/11, and I don't think it bodes well for the future of Muslim-American relations internally either. Let's see. As a native Coptic Christian from Egypt, have you asked about the persecutions that we face in Egypt? Um, I have been to Egypt, and it's interesting to see the persecutions that happen, not just between religions, but within Islam as well. And it usually comes from the Orthodox interpretation. So they usually have very strict ideas about who is and is not a Muslim, and that is very much a way for them to control the power that Islam as a religion can give them. So by saying who is and is not is very important for them, and it's unfortunately part of the Orthodox strain of Islam as well to persecute other religions. That's obviously not the entire Orthodox model. That's an extreme side of it. But I think it's important that Christians are brought in to the government and given rights as soon as possible. And I think that this can be argued through Islam, because actually Christians are people of the book, and often I was received very well as a Christian myself. And I think that you have to sort of fight fire with fire in this case. So I think the more knowledge and the more that Islam is used as a tool to give Christians rights, because they do have rights in the Quran, I think that would be very helpful and a good tactic as well. Yeah. Are there any more
Looks
questions?
like we have a question from Carl. How large a population was your survey in total or by country?
Yeah, so as I said before, we interviewed over 2,000 when we went to the Muslim world, so that's over 8 countries in 2 months. We interviewed over 2,000, and we did questionnaires, but that was, I think we got over 1,000 the first time. So these are not exact numbers. These are not poll numbers. These were open-ended questions, and we usually were interacting with people when we asked them and interviewing them at the same time. So these percentages are definitely estimates, but they're embedded in a very strong context of interviews. And then in the United States, we did the same methodology, but we interviewed over 3,000 Muslims and non-Muslim Americans. And yes, we definitely tried to vary the socioeconomic status of them, and also age, gender, interpretation of Islam. We tried to vary it as much as possible. Why do you think Muslims around the world look down on American Muslims? I think that in Islam, there's a definite bias towards the Arab world. I think that's mainly because the Prophet himself was Arab, the Quran is in Arabic, the holiest sites are in the Arab world. So there's a definite tendency for Muslims in the Arab world to be taken more seriously and more authentic. And that process we saw across the Muslim world. So when we were in Indonesia, some Muslims would tell us that an Arabization was going on, and that Muslims in the Arab world were taken more seriously than Islamic scholars in Indonesia. and they saw this as a big problem. But as far as the Muslims in America go, I think that they're looked down on because they're seen as corrupted by a Western society, and that they're a bit disconnected from the rest of the Muslim world, and that they don't have that same cultural context. So they might speak differently, they might not be able to speak Arabic or their native language, especially the second or third generations. Um, so they're seen as not really Muslim. You know, you might say you are and you look like it, and you might be Pakistani or Arab or something, but you're not really. And you see that with other immigrant populations as well, whether it's Polish or Italian or anything like that. But converts also are not taken as seriously as native born Muslims. And I think that also is a phenomenon that happens in every religion. But at the same time, I think that because of our educational system and because of the quality of Muslims that America attracts, because we have attracted Muslims from all over the world for excellent careers, I think just the quality of Muslims that America has will actually change that dynamic in the future, and that a lot of the thinking and writing coming out of the United States will start to have an effect on the Muslim world, and they will prove themselves. But so far, it's also a very young community, so they have not had the chance to establish themselves to the rest of the Muslim world. But I think American Muslims will, and they will be leaders. So, are there any other questions?
All right. Well, it looks like that's all our questions. Um, I wanted to thank Hailey on behalf of Carl Prinslow, the director at the CKC.